This month on Central Christian Church Crucial Conversations, we are talking about economic justice. Join us on Thursdays as we talk with guests who are engaged in the struggle for economic justice and listen to learn more about how you can get engaged. Welcome to Crucial Conversations with Central Christian Church. I am Student Pastor Grace.
I'm Pastor Linda.
I'm Pastor Luis.
And today we are diving into our third podcast series on economic injustice. We spent a month earlier this year talking about anti-racism, and we just wrapped up a series on standing in the need of prayer. And so now we are moving into a fresh new set of conversations surrounding the church's role in addressing, what many churches see as a mandate of reducing economic inequality and being proponents for economic justice. So, I was talking with Linda about this in our meeting on Monday this week, and we were talking about how, for me, ever since I was, in high school, I was like, well, it's just obvious. It's very clear in the Bible that we're supposed to take care of the poor. There's mandates on how we care for the poor in the Old Testament law codes, in the prophets, and Jesus talks a lot about how we care for the poor. So I'm like, this should be extremely easy. But then, it's also on the one hand, it feels like it should be extremely easy. And then on the other hand, as we were going on in our conversation, I was like, oh, well, there's this and this and this of why it's not easy. And so that's why we want to have these conversations to talk about how different faith communities are working for economic justice and how it's not always why it doesn't always feel cut and dry to us on how we do that. And especially when we talk about, the enormity of economic inequality in our world today. It's like how do we at Central even begin to respond to that? So to open up our conversation today, I wanted to bring up this wisdom from the Talmud, which says we do not need to be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. We need to do justly now, love mercy now, walk humbly now. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. And I think that is how we want to frame this conversation today about economic justice. So, Linda and Luis, can one of you start us off by telling us a little bit about how you see the church doing justly now, walking humbly now, as it relates to the church's role in economic justice?
Sure, I can get us going, hopefully. So do justly, love mercy, walk humbly. I think that as church and as well as individuals, we try to live into, all three of those areas. For me, when I think about love, mercy, that kind of leads me to sort of the more direct ways of addressing economic injustice. It's compassion. We see people who are hurting, who either are unemployed or homeless or food insecure, and our sense of, the mercy that we've received from God and from others, leads us to feel that kind of mercy or compassion for others, and to try to find ways to alleviate the hurt or the suffering. And so, as a church, in our case, there are ways that we go about that, about directly meeting people in their need, and they largely have to do with food and clothing, but also, we have a social worker, a volunteer social worker who spends time here in non-pandemic times on Mondays and helps orient people toward ways that they they can, meet the very concrete, real needs that they have. The do justly part, for me, takes us to the systems level. And I think it's really difficult, and as we were saying the other day, it's very difficult to, as an individual, to do justly when you're part of an unjust system. So I can, think about how I spend my money, where I get my products, how I spend my time. I can try to minimize with my choices the injustice that I'm participating in, but I think it's impossible to live outside that system. And so we're complicit simply because we live in it. And so that, for me, leads us as church, as people of faith, to try to address those systems. And there are a variety of ways that we do try to do that here at Central. And I think for a lot of, or part of, for me, the kind of that journey of moving from charity to justice is how we sometimes put it. We do kind of have to wrap our heads around, how, or try to understand the biblical perspective. And I think for many, many Christians, what the Bible, the message of the Bible comes only at the individual level. That it really doesn't have to do anything with government. And so I think one of the values of, some of the passages or parts of the Bible that you mentioned is sort of figuring out, how government works. Not that we're going to, replicate the way it worked at any point in the history of Israel, but that becomes a key question. We all agree we need government in some form, but what is the role of government, and vis-a-vis the role of church and individuals and other sectors?
Yeah, and it definitely feels like, depending on, I guess, like as the government in the United States is now, there's so much, I think, I hear a lot of misconceptions about, like, well, the government shouldn't take care of people, the church should take care of people. It's like, well, again, faced with the enormity of the world's need, has the church really done a great job of addressing that on its own? And depending on where you look, I think, the answer is that a lot of times the government is what comes in and is able to meet a lot of need.
How I would answer that is with the response, it goes along with the Talmudic responses, don't be afraid of the task that does not have an end. And what I mean by that is, in anything that we as a church or individuals are seeking to address, the reality is it's an ongoing work, right? Once you get to one particular goal and you've reached it, now there's something else to continue to move forward towards. And that is something that is very daunting to any person of faith, right? To be asked to continue to work to something, right? I think what I love about that response is you're not supposed to give up, right? You got to keep going towards it. You're not responsible to finish it, but you can't give up. And I think as a whole, whenever faced with the issues of economic insecurity, whether it be food or finances, giving up is what we end up doing. And so even in addressing people's physical needs, we feel like, well, at least they're getting something to eat. or at least we're able to provide some clothes, or at least we're able to address this financial insecurity for a moment of time. And that's better than nothing. Mm-hmm. And then I think we get satisfied with the work that we do, mm-hmm. and then stop. And I think this is a reminder that what we are asked to do is continue to work. Mm-hmm. And that is contrary to how we feel, mm-hmm. right?
Right.
You know, we feel good when we've done something. Mm-hmm. And this is not the trophy culture that I'm talking about, like everyone gets a trophy for participating. What I'm talking about is most people don't want to start something that doesn't finish, mm-hmm. right? Because we're saying, well, it's a waste of time. We want to be able to get something out of what we do. And that's not what it's asking us. It's asking us to be attentive, that as you address this issue, there's a response to that issue, right? So we think about, back even to our conversation about racism, right? Emancipation came, what happened? Laws changed. Okay, we're gonna play by the rules now. We can't legally segregate. We can't legally. Well, let's do these things to make sure that there's still separation between people. And the same happens when it comes to economic justice, right? We'll say, wow, we've finally gotten to a point where we've closed the gap. Well, let's start making laws now that keeps that gap even further, right? Or let's create laws that, as you are trying to be able to exercise your reason to vote, that if you're providing food to people, you're doing something wrong. And I think about, there was I can't recall where, but there was an older gentleman in his 80s or 90s who was literally spending his time feeding people, right. and was arrested. Right. A basic human necessity, right. was arrested, mm-hmm. right? He was finally, it was saying, no, he didn't do anything wrong and was able to do it. But the fact that someone said, I don't want you feeding people, right. so I created another, so he was addressing a need, mm-hmm. but then laws were created to make sure that he doesn't do it. Right. And that's what happens when we talk about, the enormity of the task. Right. You're not going to finish it, but you got to keep addressing it, because the systems will find ways to make sure that we don't accomplish what we've been asked to do. And that is our challenge, right? How do we motivate others to keep going when it seems like we're getting nowhere at times?
I'm really glad you brought up criminalization, because I think we do see criminalization of people, trying to do the next right thing. But then we also see the criminalization of people in poverty. And I think that is an attitude that we can't help but be pervaded by in the church too. It's like they're, the church at large. You've got I don't know if I'll get in trouble for saying this, but Dave Ramsey being well, it's really on you to not be poor anymore. And there's this sort of very negative perception on the character of people in poverty. And I think one thing that I have slowly been learning is that really this pervasiveness of poverty is a reflection of the character of our society, but just in a different way. It's like we have a society of such enormous wealth that allows people to languish in poverty. And then when people, and who looks so down on begging, or you need to be doing this the exact right way, the way that makes me feel comfortable, for you to, just not be poor anymore, is sort of an attitude that we see in a lot of places, not just at the government, not just in the church. It's just, you do see it permeate in a lot of different ways. And
I wonder, so in the Hebrew Bible, right, in the laws that were given to Moses, and as they were spelled out in many hundreds of laws, there is so much emphasis on economics and on the way we treat the weakest, if you will, members of society. So care for the widows and the orphans, care for the foreigners, the provision of gleaning, where you don't use all of the product from your own field. You leave a portion of it because others are going to need it. And then, maybe the most, systemically radical notion of them all, which is the year of the Jubilee, which is to wipe out all debts. Those are, I'm not saying that I'm any better than others, but those are parts of the Bible we just, kind of would rather ignore, right? Especially that debts thing, right? Once you have a debt, you should pay it off, and or I should. If you owe me money, you better pay me, eventually. So again, that's sort of a reflection of. It doesn't give us the answers for what kind of government system that it is biblical or is holy or whatever, but it gives us some values that are sorely absent in the system that we live in. Those values reside in people, and in the organizations that people form, but we live today in such a competitive, individualist, consumerist society that just seems so far from that vision of the early books of the Bible.
Yeah, when I hear you say that, I'm reminded of I don't know if it's in Psalms or it's Proverbs, and it's probably in both places, but the reminder that whatever God has given you, take it and write it on the tablet of your heart, right? And then give it to the other generations, meaning that whatever that's been given to them by God needs to be taught, right? And if you've been taught these are the laws and this is how you treat people, share that, right? Then you're taught that, you share that to your family and your children. So everyone in that community has been taught that this is how we work and treat others, and this is how we're different from everybody else. The problem is, we don't teach, we don't share those things, and when it comes to economic justice or how we help people, or what God is requiring of us to do, like you said, we don't really need to forgive that. That's not really. And so then you have a generation of people who don't know how to treat others when it comes to this particular aspect, right? You look at kids. I think kids are the perfect example of what happens when you let them be themselves, and then when they get, when they learn from us as adults, right? When they're playing on the playground, they get into an argument, and all of a sudden they're angry, but a couple minutes later they're playing again, right? What happened is gone. There's no need to remember that. We're here in this moment now, and we keep moving together. Adults, we're just like, no, I'm gonna linger on in this hurt and the pain. Not to say that that's wrong, but we want to keep and we want to hold on to it. And it's the same way with economics. We have this understanding that our success in economics is solely based on how hard we work, and that isn't true, right? When the wealth of this country was built on free labor, right? How do you expect me or others to be able to progress if you've gotten ahead on free labor and I have to pay for labor in order to get ahead? Right? So there's some uncommon grounds and there's some myths in how we talk about the wealth, or the American success. And I think that's important to remind people. Mm-hmm.
That for me alludes to one of the questions that I think we need to deal with, which is like, what does justice look like?
Yeah.
Like how do you define that? And is it everybody has the same? Is it everybody has the same opportunity?
Yeah.
Or everybody has the same access to opportunity? And so I think there's so many people who feel like, it is a just system because anybody can go to school, and everybody can go to school and can go to college and can, become whatever they want to be. which is, highly romanticized version of the situation in our country. But I think it might help to sort of, dig into that a little bit as we look into this conversation.
And I think one thing that you both have brought up a little bit is like sharing values as the church. And it makes me, because I think a lot of times we get stuck in this like, well, we shouldn't just be doing charity, but also like, if you come across someone who needs to eat, like there's nothing like you should help them eat if you are able to do that, like that. And that is, in some ways a charitable act. It's, I think, an act of like humanizing someone and their real need. But then also, okay, well, on the other end, there's the systemic, like, we should focus all of our efforts on that, and we get caught into like one or the other. And I think both are good, but I'm also wanting us to explore, like, is there something in the middle of that with the values that we're talking about? If we can come up with what those are, what we mean by what economic justice is, that we can, as faith communities, exercise our own agency within a bad system. Like, yes, we are in a bad system. There's not a lot we can do, but are there ways that we can together really look into what are these, biblical values? What are our own, and how does that inform how we think our community should act when it comes to money? It reminds me a lot of, I'm taking a class on womanist theology this semester, and we did a womanist reading, or we read a womanist reading of Feeding the 5,000 in Matthew. And so the author, Mitzi Smith, was talking about how, like, her growing up in deep poverty, the reason why her family was able to live was, first, they got assistance from the government that lasted like about 10 days into the month, and then they had to really rely on other people in poverty to help them out, to sort of piece together the rest of the month. So like everyone in that community gave out of their own lack. And so she brought that lens to the feeding of the 5,000 of the disciples bringing together not a lot of food and giving out of their own lack, and then seeing how that rippled across this community of 5,000 people. To me, that story really says something about, as someone who's never experienced poverty, and who considers themselves to be a generous person, well, am I generous to the point of I'm feeling uncomfortable about how generous I'm being right now, because then I don't have as much as I want, So like, I think that story is one that I would love to explore more, just this idea of what are some values that we can have that help us to push back against a bad system. Like, yeah, it's not going to topple it, but it is going to be that next sort of right thing to do in the face of the work that is unending.
So I think a part of the challenge is that systems function the way people want them to, right? We have the issues we have because we want it that way, right? We have people in place, like no one wants to say, I want to work towards something so that you no longer have a job. Right? And that's what we're in a sense, what we're fighting for. And then if you're saying, well, this is how I get my livelihood, and you stop this, then what am I going to do? Do I then become that person who's in need? And this goes back to, again, in many of the other conversations we've had, is how we see God and how we think God provides for us, right? One of the things that I recall from all these teachings in the Old Testament, First Testament, however you want to describe it, is a reminder to the people of God is, I provide these things for you, right? You don't have to worry, right? You think about them in the wilderness. Take what you need because tomorrow there'll be more. Don't worry about it. And so we have this idea that there's not enough. And what we keep hearing from the world is we provide enough, right? Enough food is grown and things are made that can feed the world over plenty of times. So if that's the reality, why are people going hungry? Right? Well, because we've created systems. We're no longer an agrarian culture, right? Where everyone is doing their own farming and their own stuff. So, hey, I grow this, let me trade this with you and stuff like that. We've gotten to the point where we concentrate things and then we say, okay, you distribute that and you distribute this, right? And so if I don't participate in this system, right, then I don't always get what I need. And so when I think about the issues that we faced, you know, what comes with that? And when people want to keep their power, right? When people want to keep their sense of own worth, of what it feels like to be wealthy or what it feels like to be the person in charge, I'm willing to do whatever I can to maintain that. And what we're many times really, I think, fighting is to get people to say, no, you know, love your neighbor, right? If you're willing to sacrifice, like when I hear that story is, have you ever noticed, and coming from communities of immigrant communities, coming from communities who are in the margins, I've often noticed that the individuals in your community who you think lack or have the least amount of means are the ones who give the most. So we would do pitch-ins, right? And I would bring exactly what I was asked to bring. The family that doesn't have much brings more than everyone else. Why is that, right? And it goes back to what you're saying is, I'm going to share what I have, and that's everything. That's my way of saying that you're a part of this. And if more of us have that same attitude, or remember that, you know, our families have come from that same type of situation, we can address some of these particular things.
Yeah, I think a lot of it does go back to, well, I've got two things going on in my head. I think fear is a real factor for many people, maybe not the ultra wealthy, but for a lot of people in the middle, sort of the security, our security is important enough to us that we are able to sort of either rationalize or ignore, you know, certain questions or certain challenges to the way we organize our lives. So, and it is that fear of scarcity, right? Or it's a mentality of scarcity that leads us to fear that we won't have enough if actually everybody else has enough. And then the other thing I was thinking, you know, back in terms of values or theology, is just the way we see every other person that resides on this earth. You know, I believe that we are taught that, you know, there is a spark of the divine in everybody. It's hard enough to believe that we have it inside ourselves on many days, and it's certainly hard to believe that it's everywhere else. But kind of recalling the African concept of Ubuntu, that we're so radically connected, or Martin Luther King's image of that, you know, radical mutuality of that, you know, I really cannot be myself if you cannot be yourself. I really am not free if you are not free. I really am not full, you know, if you are not full. But it's that is, again, seems a pretty far cry from where many of us, you know, live kind of on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. So I think this can be a good stopping place for us today. I am really excited to explore this idea of like how we are connected with our next couple of guests. I think there's going to be a lot of really good discussion, and I'm looking forward to being back with you guys in a few weeks to wrap this up. But thank you all for joining us for this first episode on economic justice, and we'll look forward to talking to you next week.